Hey, welcome to the Kingdoms Podcast. My name is Luke and I host this with my buddy Matt Ma. And our goal is to empower you to discover how your faith impacts culture for God's kingdom. To do that, we're sitting down with different men and women from all kinds of disciplines to uncover how they, through their ambitions and vocational skill set, make a difference in the lives of those around them. And so if this is helpful to you, we'd love it if you could like it, share it, and subscribe. In the meantime, enjoy today's episode. Well, friends, thank you again for joining us. I'm Luke Crawford and really thankful to be here with a friend and former classmate, Julian Cook. Julian, thanks for joining us.
Well, thanks, Luke. So glad to be here. Thank you for the invitation and the opportunity. And it's good to see you again. I feel like it's a reunion of sorts because it's been a while since I've seen you. And you've come a long way since the campus of Houghton College. So it's good to see you today.
Hey, thanks, brother. The same to you. For those of you who are tuning in and may not know, Julian and I had the privilege of going to Houghton College in New York State together. It's just outside Buffalo. And if you know Julian, you know he's not only a great person to be in classes with and a great presence to have on a school campus, but is among many other things a gifted musician. And I was one of many people who really, Julian loved being with you in community.
Likewise.
It was good. It was good. But I've invited Julian today just to sit down and to talk with me, specifically as we consider the point at which we find ourselves in history. Many of us have been glued to our television screens, our phones, our news feeds, reading through, thinking through, considering what's taking place in the United States and really around the world in advocating for reform when it comes to racial injustice. And I reached out to Julian knowing his own life story, and part of it, his experience as an African American and his role right now as a pastor in the States, and have asked him in this time together just to help us think and talk through what it looks like to be people who promote justice in our walk with God, and especially in our communities. So before we dive into those questions, Julian, I would love it if you could maybe just give a snapshot of who you are, what you do, the role you're serving in right now, just so that listeners who may not know you, who may not have shared life at Houghton College with us or known you from before Houghton, to give a picture of who you are.
Thanks, Luke. I am a native of the South Side of Chicago. That's where I was born and raised. My family, like most Black Chicagoans, have roots in the American South, particularly Mississippi, and moved to Chicago in the late 30s, 1930s and early 1940s as a way of really escaping the rampant anti-Black violence that was a reality of the American South at that time. The hope was that Chicago, away from the cotton fields of Mississippi and into the industry of the North, would provide a safer space, a place for more economic possibility. That was not necessarily what they found when they got there. And there's of course a number of books that have been written about that. One of them, most famously, The Warmth of Other Suns, is a book by Isabel Wilkerson that sort of details the movement of Southern migrants, African Americans, the sons and daughters of slaves, of enslaved people, and how they moved to the North, aspiring for these things, but not necessarily finding them. And my family is certainly a part of that heritage.
Wow.
They brought to Chicago, to the North, the sounds of church, music, art, literature, food. It's amazing the way that people are able to package those things deep within their souls and bring them into new spaces. And I am a part of that lineage.
Yeah.
And so raised in Chicago, but most folks who hear me speak or know me, their automatic assumption is that I have some deep experience with the South. And most of the time that's because of the reality that my grandparents and parents were from the South.
Wow.
So came to Houghton College, where I met you, where I studied music and religion, and also minored in African American studies. Went off to Boston University afterward, and worked in social ethics and African American studies. And currently, I'm a PhD student at Drew University doing a PhD in social ethics and African American studies.
Yeah.
And pastoring. I pastored a church in Boston for 4 years, which I really, truly enjoyed. St. Mark Congregational Church. It is the oldest Black congregational church in Boston.
Wow.
And so I started there when I was about 21.
Wow.
And, or 20, no, I was 23 when they hired me there at their church. And then came here to Buffalo about a year ago to serve as 2 years ago now, to serve as the director of the Houghton College East Side program, which is a 2-year Associate of Arts degree program meant to really help residents of Buffalo's historic East Side, which, if you know anything about Buffalo, that is the side of town that African Americans largely live on, and that's a longer history that we could probably talk about. But generally speaking, we serve all students of various racial backgrounds, but generally speaking, we are interested in the challenges and meeting the needs of students particular to this community. So that's what I do on a daily basis, and that's a bit about who I am.
Yeah. No, thank you, Julian. It's neat to realize that both with your heritage out of the American South, living in Chicago, going to school in New York State, and then again, further education in Boston and pastoring there, you've had the opportunity to live or be influenced by people whose lives have marked some key regions of the United States, which along with your life story, but also your education, I think more than empowers you to speak with a lot of wisdom into what we want to talk about today. And so, Julian, I kind of want to turn our gaze and kind of focus our attention on really what's taking place when it comes to calls for greater justice in the United States, and to maybe start us at a 50,000 foot view for you as an African American living in the United States right now. Can you give us your insights into the protests that are taking place right now in the U.S. and especially what you hope as a pastor, especially, will be achieved through that?
Yeah, that's a great question, Luke. I really position the protest, yes, as an African American myself, but also as someone who is deeply interested and committed in researching the lives and structures, the institutions that have shaped African American society. Yeah. Right. And so when I'm looking at these protests, I'm reading them as a part of a larger legacy.
Okay.
Of a larger legacy of Black resistance to racial oppression. And that legacy extends 400 years. You know, there's a sense in which the story erroneously is often told in a way that makes it seem that African Americans or Africans at that time simply passively accepted the realities of racial discrimination and racial violence that was first slavery and that became Jim Crow. But as one delves into the history of Black people in America, it becomes very clear that there has been a long tradition, a long trajectory of rebellion and resistance, some of them nonviolent, most of them nonviolent, but a lot of them involving some level of violence. And largely that's because anytime anybody interrupts strong, long-standing injustice, it's going to be interpreted as violence. There's just no way that for it not to be. So those types of movements, that type of resistance is always experienced by those in power as a form of violence. And so I read these protests as the latest political representation of that resistance that is a long, long tradition. So as I'm reading this and as I'm looking at the protests currently, I'm always, the two questions I'm interested in is number one, sustainability. How do we sustain the ethic that is born, the resistance ethic, the anti-racist ethic that is born out of the protest, and make it so that it does not just show up when we are holding signs at protest, but
Mm.
how do we sustain that energy so that it spills over into our policy creation,
Mm-hmm.
so that it spills over into the ways institutions are shaped, so that it makes us think about economies.
Mm.
All of those types of things are what I'm extremely interested in as far as the protests are concerned.
Yeah, no, understandably. And I think just touching on what you said a moment ago about that, really, this is a 400-year long issue.
Yeah.
And I think you have, I believe it was last year, that movie coming out, Harriet, celebrating Harriet Tubman and her efforts with the Underground Railroad. And that being, if you could say, maybe one of the beginning forms of resistance. Is that fair to say? And yet the beautiful thing about that is celebrating her life and what she accomplished. Just an incredibly courageous woman.
Yes.
But at the same time, the danger, I think, for a lot of us is saying, like, well, that happened in, the 1840s, 50s, and 60s. That's 150 years ago. We're in the clear. A lot of people have said, the civil rights movement happened in the 1960s and we're good. Obviously, we're not good. And so could you speak specifically maybe to the last just 60 or 70 years in light of what you've just said, and the fact that, yes, there has been change, but what still needs to be changed, just when you think about what these specific protests are working towards?
Yes. So I think there's a sense in which the protest of the 1950s and 1960s are dealing with many of the same things that the protests now are dealing with, but they are, but the ways in which those racial realities, those racist realities were expressed, were demonstrated at that time, look different. So what I mean by that, for instance, is that in the 1950s, the big debate becomes public accommodations. What do public accommodations look like in the United States? So we have signs over doors that read white only, Negro only. And it wasn't just that Black folks suddenly wanted to eat next to white folks. That wasn't that's the way that the story is often told. No, it was about the ways that these restrictions often became a type of entryway into anti-Black violence. So, for instance, if I'm seated in the wrong place on the bus, and we have accounts of this on the bus, which was about what the Montgomery bus boycott was about. If I'm seated in what changes every single day as the wrong place on the bus, right? There is no standard way of that seating was done on the bus. Whenever a white person got on the bus and there wasn't a seat, you had to stand up. The reality was that public discrimination, that public Jim Crow segregation became a vehicle, a license for law enforcement and for other white people to join in anti-Black violence. So for instance, if I'm on the bus, I can be carried off the bus. And we have accounts of this. I can be carried off the bus as a woman. Most of the time they were women, in very violent, in just very violent and painful and harmful ways. If I violate the rules of the Jim Crow South as far as my relationships with white people go, I could be lynched, right? So it becomes the public accommodations piece. If I stare too long at a white man, if my relationship appeared to be too close to a white woman. That was a major part of the history of lynching. I could be lynched in the United States. So the public accommodations piece became one of the first things that iteration of the civil rights movement, that 50s, they wanted to address that issue. Education was a major piece of that because we have the rule that said separate but equal, Plessy versus Ferguson. The reality was that there was no such thing. The schools were extremely subpar for African Americans. So tackling those public accommodation issues became the first means in that iteration of dealing with those issues. But if you go before that, if you go before the 60 years, stopping lynching was a basic part of the conversation. So now we've moved to another iteration of this, which is now we're having conversations about law enforcement
Mm.
and the ways in which historically law enforcement and the justice system in the United States has been used as the tool and the vehicle of
Mm.
anti-Blackness. So that's how I hope that helps to frame the issue.
Yeah.
You know, yeah, slavery is an issue. We're moving to public accommodations. We're talking about lynching. We're talking about issues of now we're talking about issues of policing. So there are various iterations. In the 1960s, Martin Luther King Jr. and other civil rights movement leaders who we don't talk about, unfortunately, very often enough, are moving to conversations about economic justice. So we have another opening. So I'll stop there, but that just gives you a sense of the various iterations of
Well, and could I say, because we want to we want to touch on police systems in a minute, but what would you say if someone were to say Ahmaud Arbery's death is just a different form of lynching? What would you say to that kind of statement or thought?
I would absolutely agree with it. Not only would I agree with it, I would probably and have from my pulpit and from various other academic spaces and even in the broader community and protests insisted that it must be read. It must be read as a part of the larger legacy of lynching in America. Yeah. What was lynching about? Well, it was a public service announcement that one had crossed a cultural boundary.
Yeah.
And the person was hung, not privately, right? Not like the movies often depict it, but publicly. And people would walk away with limbs of the victims, with fingers of the victims, with ears of the victims, mutilating the body and walking away with them as tokens of what had happened in that space. And the reason one was lynched, and men and women were lynched, we have more historical examples of men being lynched, but women were also lynched. Very often it was about your having transgressed a social boundary. So jogging in a neighborhood that you don't belong in could definitely get you lynched. There was in America this phenomenon. Here in Buffalo, we had them known as Sundown Towns, meaning you as an African American could not let the sun go down on you in this town or you would face being lynched. So you got to be out of here by 8 o'clock. We don't allow Negroes, as we were referred to at that time, on this part of town after the sun goes down, because there's you can't be up to any good. So there's this sense in which it's linked to this history of transgressing social boundaries, number one. But the second thing I want to say about Ahmaud Arbery and its historic link to the legacy of lynching is that it also becomes about the criminalization of Black flesh, that Black flesh is deviant. And so it must always be suspect. Whenever it enters a space, what are you doing here? And you see that show up in Black people being seen as walking in the wrong neighborhoods, right? Or you go to the mall, and I have certainly had this experience where I'm followed. Or if I am in a conversation and I raise my voice. Now you can yell at me all day, but if I raise my voice, I have become the angry Black man, right? And the need and the ability to control me lest I become too violent, that notion is rooted in age-old images, painful racist images of Black criminality. And so what we see in Ahmaud Arbery, first of all, is the assumption that he has transgressed a social boundary. Number two, we see that the assumption that he is a criminal, that he's doing something he has no business doing. And why is it that he would have to prove that? that he was jogging for the right reason? Who else in America is asked to prove that except for Black bodies, right? Occupying spaces that white people feel are not spaces that they ought to occupy. So, I mean, those are just important. And I've certainly had that experience living in various neighborhoods. Well,
and could we, Julian, to the extent you're comfortable, would you be willing to maybe help us understand how systematic racism has impacted your story? You've touched on a couple of things, but it would be so valuable for us to maybe see that through your lived experience.
Yeah. So that's a great question. So there are the interpersonal aspects of racism, which I typically don't rehearse, but you haven't asked me about that, but I just want to say that the interpersonal aspects of racism, that's where I'm dealing one-on-one with a white person and they will say something through a microaggression that's absolutely absurd. And I certainly have many stories about that. But I'm more interested in the question you've asked, which I think is really important, my experience with systematic racism. So one of the places that I see immediately in my personal story where systematic racism shows up is my education. So I there were schools in my neighborhood. I went to an elementary school maybe that was 3 blocks from my home. We could walk there. It was a great elementary school. We had great teachers. Largely, I would say the school was about 95% Black. We had some Latinx sisters and brothers in the institution at the elementary school as well. But when the time came for me to go to high school, the high schools in my neighborhood, to say they were underperforming is a gross understatement.
Okay.
They were often marked by a level of violence that was inherent in them because they had been infiltrated by gangs, gangs who are the result of poverty being in neighborhoods and the need to create underground economies. They were often not staffed by the best teachers. They were totally underfunded. And so the fight came for us in Chicago. We have this system, which you may not be familiar with, but is very common in America, called the selective enrollment system. That's where public schools are open to everybody, but you have a few selective enrollment schools in a city that everybody's trying to get their kid into. They're for the best performing students. And so you have to test to try to get into them, which in some ways is that seems suspect in the first place. But the schools in my neighborhood were so underperforming that when it came time for me to go to high school, my mother really pushed us, my sister and I, to get into one of these selective enrollment schools.
Okay.
And somewhere around like 640 students were fighting for each seat.
Wow.
In my high school that I ended up going to, which was in downtown Chicago.
Yeah.
Which had incredible funding, which offered incredible opportunities for college going. I think the college going rate at the neighborhood school that I was at was like 49%. At the school that I ended up going to, it was 86% of the students in my class went to a 4-year college.
Yeah. So it's night and day.
It's night and day.
Yeah.
And so I had to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning to get to school on time because the school in downtown Chicago, I live far south side. The school in downtown Chicago was so far from my house that I had to take the public transportation, get up at 5 o'clock in the morning to be at the good school and pass 5 neighborhood high schools on my way to my school. So that's one place where systematic racism showed up in my life, just the need to get an education. And it meant that I left behind so many of my classmates who I had gone to elementary school with. And that inculcated a type of division even between us because they had to go to the neighborhood schools. And I was being bused to a school in downtown Chicago where all the resources were being had. And you saw it when it came time for us to go to college. Who got into colleges, who performed well on ACTs, who got the scholarships, all of those types of things. And the difference was who lived in downtown Chicago and who lived on my part of town. My side of town was largely African American. Yeah. The downtown area, largely white. So that's just one area of my personal story where that systemic racism shows up so common.
So just to help us think through this, Julian, and I thank you for sharing that. As I think through it, what I'm realizing is, so like for you, in a sense, to have the future that you're living in now, where you're an ordained pastor, a PhD student, you've been having to, maybe for lack of a better term, fight for a certain reality. Like 8th grade, you're taking these tests to
Mhm.
get into the school for grade 9. You're 13, 14
Yes.
years old.
Yes.
And in a way, your future in some ways is hinging on what takes place as a 13-year-old.
Absolutely.
And so you're probably feeling that and recognizing that, and then obviously making sacrifices all through high school. Well, sleep is a big sacrifice to teenagers, but more than that. But you're saying, wow, like right off the bat, start a grade 9, I'm getting up at 5. Why? Because if I don't test in, and then if I don't make this work, it's going to have implications for me potentially for the rest of my life. And I've seen those implications lived out in my peers. Is that fair to say?
That's exactly what I'm saying.
And
Yes.
what white person has to make that choice at 13?
What white person has to make that choice at 13? And then when I sat down for my SAT exams, and this is where you really get to see it. None of that, when I'm sitting down taking my SAT exams next to a white student who has lived downtown, who walks to school, who's never had to face those realities, my scores, when it came to going to college, my scores were being compared to their scores without any regard for the realities that I've had to go through in order to be a successful student. Do you get my point? There was no thought, because a test score doesn't tell you all of that.
Yeah.
But if you looked at my test score, which was okay, but could have been stronger, and certainly wasn't as strong as some of my peers at the downtown high school, what should have been taken into consideration, if we were going to be just, was the reality that I woke up at 5 o'clock in the morning.
I was going to say, yeah.
And they had not. So that's the reality of racism and systemic racism. It is to require African Americans, first of all, an unfair requirement, to perform better all the time, to be exceptional. In order to make it, you got to be exceptional, to perform better than any white person has ever been asked to perform, and to do so with less resources. And for that to become a type of model, and for it to be a statement about who you are and who the community is that you come from at all of the time, that's the pressure that you live into as a person of color. And it makes no sense, because those expectations are totally unrealistic. They're just totally unrealistic. And it
sounds like, and this is an aside, but part of the consequence or the challenge of that is in you realizing that opportunity to go to school in downtown Chicago, for your peers who weren't able to to realize that, there's then that added component of even as maybe you are on a trajectory towards success, if you will, the result is division in your community, as in some ways a lack of relationship. So that's a whole other layer we probably don't have time to get into, but a whole other layer to that complexity. Wow.
Yeah. And for me to take in certain messages, even not to belabor the point about my community, though, I've often explained it this way, and I'll use this explanation now. It was as if with every mile that I was further from my home on my way to that downtown high school, a deeper sense of inferiority about myself and about the community that I came from. The further I had to go from that community to get a great education, the more my sense of inferiority was inculcated.
Wow.
And I mean, think about that. If one has to go away from your community to get resources, what does that say to you, to a child, 13, 14 years old, about what it means for them to be a part? What does that say about the place that you come from?
Yeah. It's
so
like
that's systemic racism.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a narrative that shows.
Like this is where I'm from. This is what made me.
Yes.
But I have to be here to become.
Exactly.
Ooh, wow, man.
Yeah.
Julian, you mentioned earlier microaggression and forms of that in conversation, which I think is also a valuable conversation, just in terms of so many, myself included. I think so many people who are white don't realize ways we do this. Even I think maybe a working example could be something like saying, "Oh, hey, Julian, like you're black. Do you play basketball?" Things like that. And so I wonder, could you help us? Because I know I've had moments I've looked back on and thought, wow, I was just not, I just wasn't wise. in what I said, or like thoughtful, or yeah. Could you help us to maybe understand whether it's those moments of microaggression, what they look like, or even on maybe a broader scale, what racial profiling shows up as? I know you mentioned earlier being followed around in malls, but could you maybe help us see how these components negatively impact African Americans every day?
Yeah, I will start by saying that first of all, racism is about power. And
Hmm.
it's about inordinate power. So we see them in macroaggressions,
Hmm.
right? But we also see them in microaggressions. So police, stop and frisk policing, those types of things. Those are examples of macro at the macro level, racism at the macro level, right? So it's about territorialism. It's about white people having the power to determine where Black flesh should be allowed, right? Where I should be able to go as a human being, and when I have violated the social contract that is racism, right?
Wow.
Don't overstep your boundary. We talked about that. That's a part of the long lineage of lynching that that profound history that we were just talking about. And so that's at the macro level, and we can talk about that. But then when we're moving to the micro, it is to take that mentality about power and to move it into the sort of everyday interpersonal relationships. And so it shows up in, like you said, you must be great at playing basketball, right?
Yeah.
Or you must sing well. It is about, this, back to that great image or that stereotype of Black people always being able to sing well. You must be able to dance. You must be able to do so, thus and so and so and so. And what that is about, the problem with that, is that it is restrictive. It confines my humanity to certain predetermined ideas that keep white people with the power. So it's about the conversations that you're able to draw me into. For instance, I often talk to people about the fact that as a person who works in theology and ethics and all of that, people often don't want to hear my voice until we're talking about issues of race.
I believe it. Yeah.
For me, that's a microaggression.
Yeah.
Because it is to say your value is in this space. This is where you're helping me.
Yeah.
You haven't asked me to talk about any of the other things that I know really well. I'm a scholar. I'm not just a scholar on race. That is a part of a part of who I am. So I have no problem talking about it. I do a lot of work with race and critical race theory, but I'm thinking about what it means for me to only be called into those conversations. And I have had classmates and friends and colleagues and professors who that's the only time they call me into the conversation. And that is about the maintenance of power. That is about white people being able to say, your humanity is only valuable when it helps me.
Wow.
When it helps me to understand something about myself. That's where your humanity is valuable. And and that's where we get into trouble. So I think of a microaggression as when you think that you control the conversation so much that you've got the power to invite me into the conversation in that particular place. So we've talked about all these other subjects, but you want me to talk about basketball. We talked about all these other things, but you want me to talk about this. You want me to speak into these narrow restrictions that of my humanity. That is what that's about. So you got that at the macro level, but it moves into these sort of micro spaces where it shows up. So I'll stop there and let you talk a little bit more. I hope that's helpful.
It does. Well, because it's saying, and I mean, I think as I think through it, it's saying like, I expect you to be a basketball player or a rapper.
Yes.
But if you're like, I'm actually really into medicine,
yes,
or I want to be in the trades as an electrician or something, it's like, oh, well, we don't talk about that. But what do you think of LeBron James? Like, like it's
exactly.
Yeah.
It's to make me constantly do that. And it's also then, this is the next point, to exceptionalize those who don't talk about LeBron James or who would prefer to talk about medicine. What I mean by that, it is to make those who are interested in other subjects higher than the rest of their people.
Wow.
So you listen to, so for instance, if you have limited my taste in music because of stereotypes to rap music or to hip hop. And you actually find out, which this has been a part of my story, as you know, Lou, that I actually really love classical music.
Yeah.
I become an exception. And so I become the Black man who is not really, really Black. You're not really Black. You're like me. And that, you know, I certainly have had that experience where it's like, you are like, you are finer. You're of a higher grade than most people because you like the higher things. Really, is to say you like the white things. You like the things that whiteness has placed its stamp on, which is to restrict my humanity, right? To be Black is to like hip hop. To be white is to like classical music. And then when you meet someone who troubles that, you don't know what to do with them except to either denigrate them or to exceptionalize them. So what I mean by that is they either become a token Black or they become someone that you must suppress because they're so different. In the American story, we often refer to those people as uppity Negroes. Those people are uppity. They can't be controlled, and so the role becomes to suppress that individual. They've gotten too high within themselves, right? So I just want us to think a little bit about that history. I hope that helps. I hope.
Yeah, Julian, I'm learning as we speak. Yeah. Whole new insights and valuable things, and I'm really grateful.
And you tell me if I'm talking too much. You just tell me,
brother. You go for it, man. This is valuable and it's needed. And
your questions are really good though, so that's why I'm, you know, it's a lot to think about.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, brother. I appreciate that big time because that's like I hadn't even thought about that. I'll be honest, I hadn't thought. You know, if you have a white student who wants to be an architect or a dentist or what have you, it's like, yeah, go get them. But exactly what you said, you know, for an African American and there to be this sense of like, oh wait, you want to be a lawyer? Oh wow, like that class, like you said, like that's exceptional. Like that's like, oh, I wouldn't expect that. And I hadn't thought seriously about that dynamic, but now that you say it, I see it. So thank you for helping us understand that.
So I wonder, would say, you know, white people who want to be a part of this conversation, I'll keep this short, need to be mindful of what spaces they invite Black people into. What are your relationships with people of color look like on a more regular basis? And how are you utilizing power in providing them platforms? And when you provide, think about the politics of the platform. When do you give African Americans a platform? And when will you restrict the platform? So that's just it.
And if you're only giving them a platform to talk about race, maybe you need to reconsider how you're inviting their voice into. 100%. Thank you, Julian. Man. Julian, I wonder if we could maybe slightly change directions a little bit and think a bit about a lot of what's gone down on social media recently. I know it's not uncommon to see someone have a post that says, you know, hashtag Black Lives Matter. And oftentimes in their comment section, a response will be, well, hashtag all lives matter. It's kind of treated as the go-to, like, gotcha response. How do you respond when that happens? Can you help us think through those two components, what hashtag Black Lives Matter represents and how the response of hashtag all lives matter really is received, especially by the African-American community, but maybe should be received by all of us in response to that?
Yeah. Well, I'll start by saying those who don't understand the statement, those who would respond to someone posting Black Lives Matter with the hashtag all lives matter really has missed the point. And there's really some concern, should be some concern and some consideration that they may not even want to get it because in many respects it is to bring an element to the conversation that an element to the conversation that I don't even think is necessary. So for instance, let's deal with it at a theological level. Jesus says, "Blessed are the poor, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Someone could have responded, well, what about the rich? You see, or Jesus says, quoting the Hebrew Bible, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, for it has anointed me to preach the good news to the poor and to the oppressed." And someone could say, well, what about the wealthy and those who are doing well? Do you not preach good news to them either? Right. So the reality becomes Jesus, any person, in order to really think about the issues of justice, to think about what it means to be fair, must elevate, and in theology we call this the preferential option for the poor, this idea that Jesus is more concerned with the poor than he is with the wealthy. Some people have they really struggle with that.
Okay.
But the reality is that if I'm going to be about justice, it's almost like having a child who, people who say, I treat all of my children fairly. Well, you better be, I treat all my children the same. You got to be careful with that. You've got to think about what it means to love people in the space that they are in.
Yeah.
Right. And so if in the name of loving all my children the same, if I notice that I have a child who comes along and is born with a rare with incredible confidence, right? And then I notice that I have a child who really lacks self-confidence, and in the name of loving them both the same, I never attend to the lack of self-confidence in the child who struggles. And have I been a very just parent? And that becomes the question for those who would respond, all lives matter. Well, all lives are not being treated as if they don't matter. It is Black lives specifically who are facing these realities. So I prefer to say all lives cannot matter until Black lives matter. Right? So that's what I mean by saying if the person really has missed the boat. The point is, nobody's questioning whether or not all lives matter. The question is whether or not we really have been practicing all lives, and have all lives excluded Black lives. And so, and I think, then there are the more pithy ways of describing it. Some would say it's just like Jesus talking about the poor. You wouldn't go to a march on breast cancer and shout, well, what about AIDS? You wouldn't go to a discussion on poverty and shout, well, what about feminism, right? It is to say we are trying to have a discussion about this one particular thing. And if we really are going to do some serious work, all of those things are deeply intertwined.
Yes.
All of those things are deeply interconnected. So it's, that's where I would leave that. It's rooted in a fundamental misunderstanding about what justice and fairness is. Justice and fairness is not just simply treating, if there's an imbalance, it's not treating everybody the same and maintaining the imbalance. That's thoroughly unjust. What it is to meet the needs of the individual communities, or the individual sectors, so that the scales can be balanced. Once again, back to that illustration of the child. If I notice that I have a child who lacks self-confidence and a child with great self-confidence, it is an injustice for me to go around in the name of treating the children the same, to treat that child who lacks confidence the same way that I treat the child who has an incredible level of self-confidence. No, my need is to bring that other child up in the name of love. How can you say you love that child if you won't attend to that child's needs? So that's where I would start that conversation. But I'm also finding that most people, and I'll stop after I say this, who ask that question, some are asking in earnest, but many are not asking in earnest. It's usually a way of dismissing the significance of the conversation. Well, all lives matter. It's to dismiss the significance of the conversation. It's the same way you might say women matter when we're having a discussion about the mistreatment of women, and someone will respond, well, men matter too. What? You know what I mean?
It's like you're missing the point.
You're missing the point. And so I think people who have that question really need to listen and then do a compare. Listen first about why this insistence that Black lives matter.
Yeah.
But it's funny that most of them will often say that, most of the people who say all lives matter also don't generally want you to like generalize all police officers, right? They will say, well, there are good cops and bad. So they're able to be very discriminating and,
right.
and
They're able to, like,
discerning.
specifically
To be very nuanced there, but not when it comes to the comparisons and differences that there might be between the ways in which people are treated. So I'll stop there.
No, well said, man. What you said only added to in helping us and helping our understanding. I was actually talking to a friend of mine who's a pastor, a Black Canadian here in Barrie, and he was talking on this front, and he said, it's like if your house is on fire and the house across the street is not on fire, you don't expect the fire department to pull up and spray equal amounts of water on both buildings. You're trying to eliminate the fire.
What about my house, right?
Yeah, exactly. But thank you, Julian. That was helpful, man. Because to keep learning and understanding and to see it through your eyes is so needed. Kind of keeping with that theme of social media, though. I know recently we had Blackout Tuesday. People across the board, they're blacking out their profile pictures and so on and so forth. And in a good gesture to stand in solidarity, against racism. And, I would be the first to say solidarity is good. But I wonder, could you give us some insight into actual further constructive action people, especially Christians, but all people could take beyond maybe giving into thinking like, I blacked out my profile picture. I have stood against injustice and I've promoted justice, to maybe consider what beyond that is needed. Because I think a lot more beyond that is needed.
Great point. It's a great question. That's one of I think, now many people disagree. I recognize that Facebook provides a platform for solidarity, but for me, it's one of the veneers of social media is that it allows me to think that I have really contributed in the most significant ways to simply because I have the correct status, that I've stated my claim in the fight that is anti-racism. I've staked my claim. I've made it very clear who I am. No, I want to move people past just that, what we might call a type of performative activism, to a deeper level of being conscious of my ethics. I want to move people to a conversation about their social ethics, which means I need to be conscious of my economic, where do I spend my money? I thought the United Way, a philanthropic organization here in the United States, do they have United Ways in Canada, or?
I'm not sure.
Okay, it's a major philanthropic organization here that helps with issues of poverty and so on and so forth. They sent out an email about their anti-racist vision as an organization. And one of the things that I really appreciated about them was that one of the first things on their list in responses to racism was that they were going to look at their budget and find out if they were practicing white supremacy in their budgeting.
Whoa.
I thought that was a great example of an organization, a corporation, because we've seen a lot of corporations jump on this bandwagon too. Where are you spending your money? Are you practicing? Because like you said, it's systemic. It's not just the interpersonal. There is a systemic dynamic. Where are we spending our money? For churches, I think we need to ask questions about what type of art do we have posted in our church? What type of conversations are we having? What type of music do we sing? Who feels welcome here? What worldview do we operate out of? Are we open to having that worldview disrupted? Because it may mean that we are simply replaying white supremacy over and over and over again in our worship spaces too. So those are the conversations that I would want to move institutions and people to. A conversation about economy, a conversation about what our practices, what our rituals look like, a conversation about how people of color feel in our space. Do they feel valued? Do they feel that their voices are heard? Do they feel that they're able to operate out of freedom, or are they finding it more exhausting to be in our space? And if they are finding it exhausting, are we really interested in building the type of community that feeds people, that is able to address the reasons why they may feel that exhaustion. I would want to know, moving more deeply. Well, that thought just flew. But those are just some of the questions that I would have about. Oh, this was the one. Leadership. Am I being led? This is the one that I think often that I find hard for a lot of white people. Am I being led by Black people in places in my life? What I mean by that is I will often have people, white people, come to my church and they will be moved and they will tell me how moved they are. And they will say, this is what I've been looking for. This is so powerful. I was moved beyond, and they will tell their friends about it. But that's the one time they'll come. Because in many respects, I think they'll go back to the church. They'll go back to the church that they've been complaining about. They say doesn't talk about racial justice, doesn't talk about those things. But the reality is that they cannot deal with the fact that they may be a minority in that space. To me, that is white supremacy. Are you willing to be led by Black people in spaces in your life? Or do white people have to always hold power in their grip? Are you okay with being uncomfortable sometimes? Where do we get this notion that white people can't be uncomfortable?
Oh, man. Yeah.
Where do we get this notion? Black people live with discomfort every day because discomfort is a part of the human situation. It's a part, anxiety is a part of the human condition. But I think one of the big things white supremacy does is that it tries to hedge off white people from anxiety. And it does that by courting off difference. It does that by establishing a hierarchy economically where white people always are at the top. And so until we're willing to disrupt that hierarchy, to acknowledge the fact that anxiety is something that all of us ought to be ready to live with, we're going to be in trouble. But I would ask us to explore this question of discomfort, of inconvenience, of inconvenience. I mean, some of the times where I've experienced racism the most in my daily walk in life is when a white person has been inconvenienced by me. There's this sense that I ought to get out of the way. It reminds me of my grandfather in the South. He used to talk about how they used to have to get off the sidewalk when white people walked by, right? This notion that I ought not even be inconvenienced with your story, or inconvenienced by your flesh, because I'm superior to that inconveniencing. When really none of us are. It's a part of what it means to be in human community.
Yeah.
So that's where I would stop.
So yeah, I feel like you could say, even in some ways, so with that, we see a love of comfort or familiarity or predictability, even contributing in certain ways to injustice if we're not careful. And I wonder, Julian, tell me if this could be maybe a couple accurate examples, because I'm just thinking about our listeners and wanting to give them some specific handholds on this. Two things. One, for our listeners and for those watching this, just consider this question, especially if you're white, and especially if you go to a predominantly white church. When was the last time your pastor preached a sermon that was either specifically confronting racism or even in a significant way acknowledged that?
Yeah.
Just to ask that question, because I've been asking that question of pastors around me, and very few of us can actively recall when that has happened. Yeah. And maybe the second thing I would say when you talk about that, being willing to be uncomfortable or inconvenienced, part of that, what I hear, Julian, tell me if this is fair to say, is just having an appreciation for the diversity that different races can bring. And I think about times that I've been a part of an audience, maybe hearing someone from either an African-American community or somewhere else singing in some way. And in a beautiful way, just being emotive and engaged and moving like with the music, and being in the audience with other African Americans who are moving like with them. And you can see especially sometimes in white people, not just white people necessarily, but you can see this kind of like, what's going on? And to maybe say, to alert us in those moments, to stop and say, man, if that were to happen, even just in our churches, and creating those spaces where this diversity and creativity, which is good, maybe not what we're used to, but good, is injected, for people to stop and say like, wow, this is beautiful.
Yeah.
This is excellent. Instead of just being like, oh, wow, not used to that. Yikes.
Yeah.
Could that be, maybe would those two things maybe be some examples that give some handholds to what you were saying?
I think those would be two excellent examples about, and that gets back to the thing about practices. Where do our practices engage this sort of anti-racist work? Anti-racist work is not something we do one time. I preached one sermon on racism. It's about, even if I never say the word racism, what am I doing in my practices, in my liturgy, in the hierarchy and organization of my church, in our programming, that tears down, that dismantles white supremacy in this space? That's the question.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think you're right. Often, I think that was a wonderful example. Just having an openness, I would say, even past just past the sort of ritual elements in service, where there might be a singer who may be more emotive than our congregation is used to, or may do it a different way. Have some openness to having your worldview completely disrupted.
Yeah.
And recognizing that there may be a person, not just Black, but any person, who might disagree with your worldview. And that is not the supreme, and I'll explain what I mean by that, but that your view on that particular issue is not the supreme gospel ethic on that matter.
Yeah.
And I think that's important for white Christians in particular, and for Black Christians to think about, because of the ways that white supremacy has become so enmeshed with Western Christianity. Right? Western Christianity has largely been the means by which the message of white supremacy has been coded, right? I mean, you see it in the iconography of churches, you see it in stained glass windows, you hear the teachings, you hear those types of things. There's a deep enmeshment, a deep intermingling of Christianity in the Western world and white supremacy. So one of the ways that we can start to dismantle that intermingling is by recognizing that a conflict in view between ethnicities does not mean that we don't both acknowledge the power of the gospel, right? That we don't both value what the gospel means, though we may come to two very different conclusions about how that functions, about what the role of the gospel is in a given situation. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, and to your point about white supremacy in our churches, I think a lot of people would hear that and say, okay, whoa, like too far. And I would maybe, just to leave this tidbit with people, say, when was the last time, like you said, you ever saw a stained glass window with a Black or an Asian angel, or portrayal of Jesus, or just even one of the apostles?
Right. I was gonna say, we don't even have to go to Jesus, right? Let's start with angels. Let's start with the Apostle Paul. Yeah.
But just right there, so many of us can say like, oh, like I never have. So
exactly.
Yeah, and that's just one example. Just one example. Huh.
And it shows up in crazy ways, Luke. I mean, I was born and raised in a Black church, a strong Black church. But the Jesus we had Jesus in our stained glass window. He was white. So that's what I'm saying. White supremacy has infected. I mean, even in a Black church, the fact that all of the Jesuses in our Black church were white.
Yeah.
In every Sunday school classroom, there was a picture of Jesus. He was always white. And you had a bunch of little Black kids learning in these spaces. What does that mean for Jesus to never be able to look like me? What does that mean? So, yeah, I think we do have to think about that, right? Yeah. That white supremacy has infected spaces of color, too.
Yeah. I never thought of the stained glass example till you said it. So again, thank you. I'm just learning as we talk. Julian, you mentioned the gospel earlier, and man, obviously there's this place where I think in a good way, Christians, followers of Jesus, should be right now being stretched to consider how the gospel engages, equipping them to respond to culture. And so I wonder if we could look at it, maybe a couple areas where we're trying to figure out as a culture, man, how does the gospel inform this role or our understanding of scripture or things like that? And I just, I would be the first to say, and I think you might resonate with this, that there are many honorable policemen and women out there. And you may even have some in the congregation you pastor. And so whether you're speaking to, a police officer out there who is really intentional to promote racial justice, is seeking to bring unity and reconciliation, or whether you're talking to a police officer that you say Black Lives Matter and they're right back at you with condemning, suppressive, negative language, how are you engaging with those people? And even to ask maybe on a very specific level, do you even have police officers you're pastoring in your congregation or even mentoring in some way during this time?
Yeah, that's a great question. I have in both congregations that I pastor taken pretty strong stances on I started off taking a pretty strong stance on police reform. I have since become more interested in actually defunding aspects of the police department. Not in the sense that I don't believe that police are important to actually do. I just think that police are asked to do too much in the American context. And I think there are other countries like Canada who do, when I think of Toronto and some of the work that they've done, who do a much better job as far as policing is concerned. And what I mean by that is that police aren't handling mental health crisis. Police aren't, and in America, if your house is broken into, you call the police. And in America, if you see somebody having a mental breakdown on the street, you call the police. To me, that's
a problem.
That's a problem. To me, that's a major problem. And in both, I wanted to say that to say in both congregations I've led, I have had police officers and law enforcement, and this has been a place of difficulty for us at times. Though many of them know that I support and love them as individuals and value their work. I've also had to minister at times when police officers have been victims of violence. So I've preached the funerals of officers who were killed in the line of duty. So, I mean, so to have to serve in those ways, but to also take a strong stance against the culture that is police brutality has been a real tension. I want to acknowledge that in my own ministry. But let me explain it the way that I often do that work.
Yeah, please do.
In those contexts. So first things first is I think it's important to keep the humanity of police at the front of our conversations. The humanity of all persons involved in a line of work. And what I mean by that is the issue that we have at this point in our global story is the issue of and I hate to keep bringing this up because I'm sure some people are like, well, he keeps saying that word, but I'm going to keep saying it because this is the reality. White supremacy is what we want to keep at the forefront of our mind, and the realities of white supremacy manifest themselves in different ways. I want to keep that as a system that any profession can become involved in. So the way that I'll explain it is, I'm a college professor. I am also a pastor. I, as a college professor, can become involved, can allow myself to, if I'm not intentional, to become involved in the cycle, in the routine that is white supremacy. What I mean by that is I can hold up in my curriculum constantly the perspectives of what we used to call in education the great white men theory of education, where we read all of our knowledge, all of our philosophy, all of our reading and curriculum comes from the Eurocentric perspective.
Okay.
Right?
Yep.
I can practice that as a professor and become a part of the problem. Or I can, with intentionality, try to open up try to open up my syllabus, try to open up my curriculum, and actually in my work as a professor, which could be a problematic profession, actually come to practice an anti-racist ethic in my classroom work. As a pastor, pastors can very easily abuse their power. We've seen it over and over and over again. Whether it be pastors who have committed sexual offenses or any of, it does not mean that all pastors are bad. What it may mean is that there are systemic problems. What it may mean for me as a professor is that there are systems that I can, there's a system that I can live into that can become problematic. And so my goal, my responsibility is to acknowledge the reality of those systems. Is to acknowledge, not to deny it, not to go, well, all professors aren't bad when people bring up the issues with the systemic, with the systems, with the system of professors, right? I mean, there's a system in academia. If you've ever had a bad professor, you will know what I'm talking about. Yeah. There's a system in academia of professors holding inordinate power and being able to get you out of a program if they want to get you out of that program, especially when you move to the graduate level. In the same way with pastors, there are definitely pastors who abuse their power, who keep chokeholds on churches and chokeholds, who suppress the voices of women, who suppress the voices of young people as pastors. And for me to sit up there and go, every time a woman wanted to mention that women are not treated fairly in the church, well, not all pastors,
yeah,
is to do a disservice to what she's talking about. No, if I'm going to be on the right side here, I have to acknowledge that I know some pastors who do not allow women to preach from their pulpits. I know some. It's to acknowledge that I may be a part of a system that is problematic, but I'm trying to live a different way. And so usually when I explain it to police officers that way, they already have it. They're like, oh, I get it. I may be a part of a system that does have some problems.
Yeah.
And my job becomes to live intentionally, to live counterculturally, especially as a Christian, in such a way that I bring a level of honor to that profession.
Yeah.
Do you get what I'm saying?
I do. Yeah.
And so it's not to ignore the system in the name of keeping good pastors, good professors, good cops. No, it's to acknowledge the problems with the systems so that we can become better professors, better pastors, better police officers, and deal with the real pain. I have sat with people who've experienced some real pain as a result of church. If you've ever talked to a woman who has felt called to ministry and who has been denied a place in the pulpit, they really struggle. And the worst thing I can do in that moment is to say, well, not all pastors. You're painting too broadly it's too broad.
Just to disqualify the pain that they're feeling and articulating to you.
Yeah, all lives matter.
Yeah.
All lives matter. Right? No, it's to listen and to recognize that I may be a part of a problematic system.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that I'm trying to do something different.
Yeah.
But I'm in it. I'm a part of it.
And so there's, to some degree, that I have a responsibility to act. To
disrupt. Remember we talked about earlier about disruption, because people always ask me, well, what am I supposed to do? My view, get in the way of injustice. Get in the way of evil. What I mean by that is disrupt the machinery, throw a monkey wrench in the machine. But racism is a machine that operates. They're not people there pulling the levers of racism anymore. And that's the way that most people think about racism. They say, well, I don't do that. I don't say those things. I'm not pulling the levers. Well, in my view, white silence is white violence. There is no such thing. You are either anti-racist or you are on the side of racism. That's the way that it goes. You are part of the system. You're a part of what makes the machinery operate. So my responsibility becomes to disrupt. My question every day is, how am I disrupting the machinery of evil?
Hmm.
How am I disrupting that so
Yeah.
that it's not routine? It's
Yeah.
not regular. It's not every day.
Yeah. Can I ask, with that, when you talk about that disruption, to kind of look at the opposite side of that, then what are some of those things you are then looking to build, looking to create, looking to move towards? And I mean, maybe there's a scripture passage that is directly, inform that, both that confrontation of racism, that disruption,
Mhm.
but then also that understanding of this is what we're seeking. This is the gospel driven reality we are working towards. Uh, is there anything you can speak to on that front?
Sure. So passages that stick with me, one of them I quoted already, Luke 4:18, of course, quoting from the prophet Jeremiah.
Mm,
The Spirit of the Lord is upon me,
mm,
for he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor, to the oppressed, and to
mm,
set at liberty the captives.
mhm.
That is the message that Jesus starts his ministry with.
Yeah.
That's his, if one would say, that's his Facebook status, right? That's
Yeah.
that's
That's what he's
his
going for.
tagline. That's
Mm,
his description of his own ministry. And as I think about the prophets, Micah 6:8, what does the Lord require of thee?
mm,
To live humbly, to walk justly, to love mercy, to
mm,
walk humbly with God,
mm,
right? And so, this idea that justice is, oh, it's just part of the work of ministry. It's just part of the work of the ministry of Jesus, is really to ignore what Jesus stands for.
mm,
The any King Martin Luther King Jr. said it this way: any gospel that does not, any message, any spirituality, any religion that that talks about the soul, but does not talk about the realities that damn the soul, the poverty that pushes people to act, to do things that are destructive, those realities that does not, once again, disrupt the machinery of evil, is really no good news at all. And we see that in the
mm,
gospel of Jesus Christ.
mm.
That's his statement out of the gate. And I know we tend to, in many spaces, spiritualize away what Jesus means by the poor,
We do.
and we spiritualize what the prophets are talking about. But Jesus is talking about poor people.
Mm,
And so I would encourage folks to look at the book of Luke,
mm,
to read it and to see how much Jesus has to say about the poverty
mm,
in which people live, the subjugation of his own people
mm,
under the thumb of Roman oppression.
mm.
And then think about, if Jesus was simply preaching a mamby-pamby gospel, then why in the world was he killed? That's no
Yeah.
threat to the establishment.
Mm,
This man was killed in a way, and I think the Western church definitely has to think about this. This is where I think Brother James Cone's book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree, becomes an important book.
mm,
Jesus is killed in a state-sanctioned execution,
mm,
uh, in the same way that lynching is. He's hung from a tree.
mm,
And they serve the same functions. Jesus is executed publicly on a hill so that the whole town can see that
mm.
this is what happens to you if you violate the mores of the culture, if you
Wow.
challenge the power of Rome. This is what happens to you.
Yeah.
What is lynching but a message that if you challenge the mores of white supremacy, this is what happens to you. If you jog in a neighborhood you have no business jogging in, if you dare challenge police for their abuse, this is what can happen to you.
Mm,
That's what that knee on the neck of George Floyd meant. That's what an officer bursting into the home of Breonna Taylor meant and killing her.
mm.
She's a city worker and you kill her on her couch.
Hmm.
It is to say, I can do what I want with you at any point. And so, yeah, we need to think
Yeah.
about we need to
Yeah.
think about the link between that and the cross of Christ.
Yeah.
Yeah. Don't rush to resurrection. We love, you Baptists like me, right? We
Yeah.
love to get to resurrection early
Yeah.
Sunday morning, right?
Mm,
We love that part. But don't rush to resurrection, because the
mm.
reality is we are an Easter Sunday people living in a Good Friday world.
Wow.
And so we got to sit with Good Friday. Easter comes once a year, but Good Friday seemed to come a whole lot.
Yeah.
They seem to come a whole lot. So I think we just better think about that.
Man, would you say that one more time? We are an Easter Sunday
people living in a Good Friday world.
Think about that.
Yeah.
Think about that. Julian, I feel like I have more questions now than I did when we started, but in honoring this time together, I would love to maybe land the plane just by inviting you to help me and help our listeners to consider, are there any online resources, whether this is websites, articles, blogs, movies, books, that you would really encourage people to engage with, to learn from, to understand both confronting racism and advocating for justice in our world today?
Yeah. Once again, thanks so much for this time, Luke, and thank you for
100%.
Thank you for strong questions, because I have a lot of these conversations, and sometimes the questions aren't as great as yours. You've just given a lot of great questions today, which means you've really thought about this. And
100%, man.
are not just checking a box. So I really appreciate your doing that.
My privilege, man.
I will separate my last comments as far as resources are concerned into two sections.
Sure.
So there, right now, if you get on Netflix is doing something that is pretty amazing. They are offering an entire collection of movies on the Black experience right now.
Okay.
Excellent documentaries. I mean, we're talking about maybe 30 years of films on all of the top films on issues of racial justice and the Black experience. I just think people ought to take advantage. You could be taking, essentially a course on critical race theory on Netflix right now. If you just watched, I would say, half of the documentaries that they're offering. I think they're calling it the Black Collection or the Black Experience Collection. If you get on Netflix at this very moment, it will pop up. So all you have to do is get on while they're offering it. Watch some of those documentaries. Start with the documentaries. Don't even go to the movies yet. Start with the documentaries. And I think you'll be able to see some pretty significant information. Now, some books that I would offer to just start off with, I think The Christian Imagination by Willie James Jennings is one of the most foundational texts when you're talking about the relationship of Christianity to the origins of race.
Okay.
Excellent book. There's another book called Stamped from the Beginning. It's by Ibram Kendi. It's about the history of racist ideas in the Americas. So he is actually, as a historian, walking through a trajectory of the development of racist ideas here in this country. That's a great book. I would also read Whiteness and Morality by Jennifer Harvey. I think that's a book that every white person should read who wants to do anti-racist work, who's serious about this work. Because she's asking questions about whiteness as a moral crisis, cultural whiteness, not phenotypic, but cultural whiteness as a type of moral crisis, right? What does it mean for white people to hold, in a white supremacist culture, to hold so much power? And how can you be a Christian holding that much power? When the gospel is really clear about what happens to people who hold a whole lot of power. Right. So she's asking those types of questions, even about reparations. What does that look like? How do we repent? Is it possible to repent? You asked that question earlier. How do we repent of the atrocities of race?
Yeah.
In the same way that a man might ask the questions, how do men repent of the ways that women have been so victimized? Right. It seems almost like too much is it possible? So she asked those questions. It's a really good book. I would also read Democracy in Black by Eddie Glaude, The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. The New Jim Crow, which is about mass incarceration in America. An important book, a monumental book. I would read Feminist Theory by Bell Hooks, especially if you're trying to think about the intersections of race and gender. I think that's an important book. Then if you're trying to say, what does racism really look like? What are we talking about when we're talking about white supremacy? Because like you said, a lot of people hear that word and they go, what? That's why I use the word, actually, because I want to get people used to hearing it. I want to take away the sort of stigma, in a sense, around it and just let people deal with the fact that this is a reality. There's a great book by George Yancey who is one of the key critical race theorists in this country, is titled What White Looks Like. What white looks like. So what is it that you're talking about when you're talking about white supremacy, Julian? George Yancey is helpful in saying, like, this is what the culture of whiteness looks like from a Black perspective.
Yeah.
It's a great, great work.
Wow.
So that's where I would start.
That is, wow. That's more than enough for a good starting point. And especially going into, well, being in the summer months now.
Yeah.
People have time to watch documentaries and to read books.
Yes.
So
yeah.
Thank you for compiling that really helpful list. There's some texts I'd heard of, but other things I hadn't. And so, yeah, that is very helpful. Julian, just if people wanted to get in touch with you, learn more about you, or your church community, what could they go to get that information?
Absolutely. You could go to www.macedoniabuffalo.com, which is the church that I am privileged to lead here in Buffalo, New York, historic church. You can go there and find out all sorts of information. You can email me, please. I enjoy these conversations. mmbcpastor1@gmail.com. M as in Mary, M as in Mary, BC pastor1@gmail.com, and we can talk. I will also, you can look our church up for messages on YouTube. Just type in Macedonia Baptist Church Buffalo, subscribe to our channel, and our messages are there live streamed every single week. I will be also teaching an 8-week course beginning in July at Houghton College titled Race and American Christianity. So if you are interested in really delving into some of the texts that I named and really wrestling with some of these ideas about the connection between Christianity and race, I would encourage you to take the course. We are offering it for credit. We are offering for credit. So yeah.
Can people audit that course?
Say it again.
Can people audit that course?
Oh yes, it's open to the public. It is not just, it's a public course. All you have to do is sign up. So I will get Luke the link, and I would love to see some Canadian brothers and sisters in that course. Wow.
Julian, wow, this has been a helpful, a powerful, a really insightful conversation, and I'm very grateful for what you've shared. And just wonder, would you be willing just to pray for us, pray for the United States, pray for the church, pray for this moment in history and really believers everywhere and our response. And I think really following the Spirit of God in our response. Would you be willing to do that in this moment?
Sure.
Thank you.
Let us pray. Precious God, we thank you. We thank you for the opportunity to come together in conversation, oh God. We thank you that your love transcends conflict. It transcends racial division. We thank you that your love even transcends violence. And we ask, God, that as we stand in this moment, in the spirit of the prophet Isaiah, here am I, send me, that you would begin to show us what you are sending us to. As we think about the deaths of George Floyd, of Breonna Taylor, and of countless people of color throughout the history of the Western world, God, we ask that you would deeply look into us and open our eyes to those whose necks we may be kneeling on, oh God, spiritually speaking, maybe not physically, but spiritually speaking. Open our eyes and remind us that we are the breath givers, just like you are the breath giver, and not the breath takers. Help us in our living, in our walk, in our justice seeking, to give life. Help us to stand in unity. Teach us to love one another. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Thank you so much, Julian.